لا إله إلا الله. جزاك الله خير. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونتوب إليه، ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله تعالى فلا مضل له، ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له جل عن المثيل والشبيه والكفء والنظير، وأشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمد بن عبد الله عبده ورسوله، أدى الأمانة ونصح الأمة وكشف الغمة وتركنا على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. فصلوات ربي وسلامه عليه وعلى آله الطيبين وأصحابه الغر الميامين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة في الدين بدعة، وكل بدعة ضلالة، وكل ضلالة في النار، وإنما توعدون لآت وما أنتم بمعجزين. قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم: يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. We praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We thank Him. We testify to the fact that there is nothing worthy of worship except Allah. He is alone and He has no partner. And we testify to the fact that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His true servant and His final messenger, whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent as a mercy to the entire creation, and whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave for each and every single one of us as the most complete role model and guide for whoever seeks happiness in this world and success in the next. After welcoming our brothers and sisters to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for another blessed Friday on the doorsteps, even closer now to Ramadan, with the excitement that comes and with the longing that comes to be able to witness another Ramadan, there's also competing emotions. At least emotions maybe internally that we sometimes are too embarrassed or politically correct to say. Maybe a fear, maybe an anxiety, maybe a just this recognition that for an entire month I can't have my lunch, that for an entire month with work and with school, how am I going to be able to get through this month? And maybe even the creeping thoughts that this month in some ways can be a burden for us. It can be a difficulty and a hardship. And it's not just related to this particular month or this particular action of worship, but a lot of times that thought can come to us. And it's natural to an extent, no doubt. Getting up for Fajr every single day is not easy. A lot of these different actions of worship, they have an element of, difficulty to them that we recognize and we acknowledge. And if we see them as a burden or a hardship or a difficulty, I came across a very beautiful shift in perspective that one of the scholars of Islam, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he gave. And I thought it was extremely beneficial, not just for how we see the upcoming month of Ramadan. May Allah allow us to reach the month of Ramadan. but also just how we have, what's our perspective towards ibadah, towards worship in general, if we see it as a burden or as a hardship. He says, rahimahullah, لا يجد المؤمن في أوراد العبادة كلفة ولا تصير تكليفا في حقه فإنما يفعله المحب الصادق ويأتي به في خدمة محبوبه هو أسر الشيء إليه وألذه عنده ولا يرى ذلك تكليفا. Very, very beautiful. He says that the believer, and this is a standard that we strive towards, right? It's not something that comes right away. But he says that the believer does not see their actions of worship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a burden. Rather, he sees them as the most beloved thing to him or to her. And it's something that they find joy in. Why? Because they recognize it's a perspective shift. That if this action of worship is coming from a place of love, then there's nothing more beloved to that person than to be in the service of their beloved. Think about it in your own relationship. Someone that you deeply love and care about. What you would do to put a smile on their face. The things that you know make them happy. That you go out of your way. And there may be a level of hardship on you to do it. But knowing that it makes them happy, that it pleases them, brings you a level of joy where you don't see it anymore as a hardship. And that is what he is saying here. And he says, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He never calls the commands and the prohibitions that He gives us, He never calls them a burden. Rather, He calls them an advice. He calls them like maw'idha, like an exhortation, like a strong, advice in essence. He calls them a wasiyah. He calls them like a will. And He calls them a rahmah. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He calls these actions of worship that He has legislated for us a mercy, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the only time He mentions this word, taklif, or it being a burden, is when He negates it from us. When He says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala negates the idea of these actions of worship being a burden on us, but changes our perspective towards them. So then how do we develop this perspective of these actions of worship being something that we love to do, that we find joy in, that we find to be an honor? And that's what they are. Another quote from one of our scholars, Ibn Ata'illah, he said, he gave 3 reasons or 3 ways that we acknowledge and we recognize that our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually an honor for us. It's a blessing for us. He says, when you perform an act of worship, and this can be your fasting, it can be your remembrance of Allah, whatever it is. He says, أَكْرَمَكَ اللَّهُ بِكَرَامَاتٍ ثَلَاثَةٍ. Allah honored you with 3 distinct things when you perform that action of worship. Think about you being here today in Jum'ah, sitting here. Allah has honored you with 3 distinct things. He said, number 1, جَعَلَكَ ذَاكِرًا لَهُ وَلَوْلَا فَضْلَهُ لَمْ تَكُنْ أَهْلًا لِجَرَيَانِ ذِكْرِهِ عَلَيْكَ. SubhanAllah. He says, He gave you the ability to remember Him. He's the one who gave you the tawfiq, facilitated for you to remember Him. And if He didn't see you as worthy, He would have never allowed His remembrance to flow through you. How is that for a perspective shift? Sometimes when we do actions of worship, we feel like we're doing someone a favor. What he's mentioning here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the honor of allowing you to remember Him. And again, just look at it from the perspective of our worldly life. If you wanted to go and meet with the CEO of your company, or you wanted to go and meet even with the mayor of Naperville, can you just walk in and have a conversation with him? It doesn't work like that. Because you're not considered to be at that level that you can meet with someone of that status. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you that ability. Then He says, وَجَعَلَكَ مَذْكُورًا بِهِ إِذْ حَقَّقَ نِسْبَتَهُ لَدَيْكَ. He says He made you remembered through Him, and He confirmed your relationship with Him. Look, all of us are the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether we choose or not. Right? So there's creator and there's us creation. What He's saying here is that when you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are elevating and changing your status. From going from being creation, just creation, creator, to you now are choosing to be worshipper. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the worshipped. You are the rememberer, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is remembered. You're increasing and you're changing your relationship, your nisbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then number 3, وَجَعَلَكَ مَذْكُورًا عِنْدَهُ فَتَمَّمَ نِعْمَتَهُ عَلَيْكَ. And then He remembered you in His company subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so He made His favor on you complete. And the scholars say this is the highest level. That when you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being here in this gathering here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above 7 heavens, يعني رب الملكوت, that the owner, the king, is remembering you. أنا عند ظن عبدي بي. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am as my slave thinks of me. فإذا ذكرني في نفسه ذكرته في نفسي. When you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by yourself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remembers you by His self, جل وعلا. وَإِن ذَكَرَنِي فِي مَلَإٍ ذَكَرْتُهُ فِي مَلَإٍ خَيْرًا مِنْ. When you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you're engaging in a type of worship communally, like this here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remembers you. Think about that. By name, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acknowledges you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honors you. This perspective shift towards ibadah allows us to taste the sweetness of being engaged in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we make it to Ramadan, we ask Allah to allow us to reach Ramadan, that we look at it with this perspective that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is honoring us, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us an opportunity to come close to Him, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen us to be from His worshippers. وَمِمَّا زَادَنِي شَرَفًا وَتِيهًا وَكِدْتُ بِأَخْمُصِ أَطَأَ الثُّرَيَّا دخولي تحت قولك يا عبادي وأن صيرت أحمد لي نبيا. One of the famous scholars, he says, the thing that made me so proud and made me so happy, gave me the highest honor, دخولي تحت قولك يا عبادي, to be included under that call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He says, Ya ibadi, O my slaves, O my worshippers. That is the honor that we have by being the worshippers, by being the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to take advantage of this blessing. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us constantly grateful for this blessing. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the opportunity to actualize this blessing. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور. اللهم صل. الحمد لله على فضله وإحسانه وأشكره على توفيقه وامتنانه وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له تعظيما لشأنه وأشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمد بن عبد الله عبده ورسوله الداعي إلى رضوانه. أما بعد فأوصي نفسي وإياكم بتقوى الله عز وجل. ثم اعلموا عباد الله أن الله سبحانه وتعالى أمركم بأمر بدأ فيه بنفسه وثنى بملائكته وثلث بكم أيها المؤمنون فقال عز من قائل إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وأذل الشرك والمشركين ودمر أعداءك أعداء الدين. اللهم انصر المسلمين والمستضعفين والمجاهدين في كل مكان. اللهم كن لهم معينا ونصيرا ومؤيدا وظهيرا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون فاذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم واشكروه على نعمه يزدكم ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون